and so on.
And so on. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me at the conference. Thank you, Yossi. Thank you, most of all, I suppose, to my parents for lots of things, but without whom I certainly wouldn't be here. And let me try to answer maybe a few of those questions, and we can save a few of them for the Q&A. But I also want to start out to say a big thank you. It's great to be in Israel for many, many reasons, professional and personal. But some of you may have noticed recently in the last few weeks a report from a company called ComScore that said that of all the countries in the world, Israelis use more social media than anybody else. And I suspect you probably all know this already. Spend about 11 hours a month, which means it's a great thing for many companies, for many of us, and certainly for Facebook. We announced a year ago that there are over 3 million Israelis active on Facebook, and that number has continued to grow. I can, of course, do the math and just look out in the audience and also figure out that this means that right now, as I'm talking, any number of you are doing this and doing other things, and that's okay. Hopefully some of you are on Facebook, and for that, I thank you. But what I want to try to do is just spend a couple of minutes talking about why is it, what are the changes that are happening that are driving so many people, hundreds of millions of people, as Yossi said, around the world, to spend more time on social networks, on sites like them, and what are some of the implications of that? The big move that I think we see happening today is an evolution from the information web, a transformation towards the social web. That if you think about the history of the internet, and it's a very brief history, and you don't have to come to a city like Israel to say this, but 2 decades or so, history is not a long time. But if you think about, just for yourself, how your life on the internet has evolved, it's sort of went from first about 20 years ago where you might get an email address and you could use a browser and find some basic information, to then innovations, people like Google and search engines and Jimmy and Wikipedia came along and organized that information and created ways for people to then actually upload information, share information. But it was largely impersonal. If you think about what you did on the internet, it was largely about answers to questions that started. They were what questions. It wasn't personal. You weren't out there as yourself. And in fact, people were a little nervous. People liked a little bit of obscurity, a little bit of anonymity. And what Facebook is a part of, and the evolution that's happening today, is really turning that on its head, because Facebook only works if you are yourself. I'm out there as David Fischer with all of my friends and all of my connections, and you suddenly create all sorts of opportunities when you rebuild the web around people, when you go from what to the who. Because if you think about what suddenly becomes possible when you're there with all of your friends and all of the people that matter to you, as well as the organizations that matter to you, the connections to government, whether it's connections to your university, to sports teams you like, to brands, to companies, whatever it might be, is that the whole experience suddenly becomes personal, and it suddenly becomes much more like the way we live our lives. Because if you think about it, when you meet someone at a conference like this, or you meet an old friend, or you come and visit a family member, you say, what's new, how are you doing, and you engage in conversation. And this is what we do when we log on to Facebook, and we think it's why hundreds of millions of people come to Facebook every day, is you go and you log in and immediately see what your friends are doing, what they're talking about, and what they have to share. And this drives more sharing and more connections. And so when we think about our mission at Facebook, it's really the first thing is about building out what we call the social graph. And this social graph is just this map of all of the connections of who you're friends with. And it's not just who, it's also people, it's organizations, it's companies. But I always like, one of the great things about Israel is there's a line of Yossi's that I really like when he explains Israel. He says, in Israel, the social graph is really simple. Everybody knows everybody. And it's true, at least Yossi knows everybody. That much, I think, is clear. But increasingly around the world, you have the opportunity then to connect to the people that you care about and then go and keep up with them in meaningful ways. And the question that Yossi asks is, is it a fad? What does it matter? So what if you can connect to people? Well, interestingly, while it enables lots of people to spend lots of time just catching up with things, it also has some profound experiences that it creates when people do that. Because if you think about the same system that enables teenage girls to share all the things, all the shopping they did, all the new clothes they buy, also empowers people around the world to have a voice in ways that they haven't before, to be on an equal playing field, on a level platform, perhaps with governments, and to actually gather, to communicate across borders. And so when you see that start to happen, you start to realize why some of the changes that we're seeing in the world and in this region as people get empowered happen as a result of the types of social connections that happen. So let me then just talk a little bit about the implications for where we think this goes as we continue on Facebook to build out the social graph. And we think about ourselves really as a platform. We are, after all, a website, but we're a platform that anyone else can tap into and share stories and enable sharing among your connections. And what we really believe is that industries are all going to be transformed and become more social. Some in ways that we can predict today, some in ways that are unclear. But let me just give you two examples about the type of transformation and the power of social experiences. At Facebook a few years ago, when the site was pretty new, we rolled out photo sharing, which is now a pretty common application that people use photos for. But at the time, Facebook wasn't much more than sharing of your friends and with your friends and posting some basic information about yourself. And what we noticed was you could put a profile picture of yourself, and that people were changing that profile on a regular basis, monthly, weekly, in some cases even daily, because they wanted to use that as an opportunity to express themselves. So light bulb went off. We said, well, they probably want photo sharing. And we created really quickly a photo sharing site, photo sharing application. And it was worse than every other photo application out there on the web, and there were some great ones out there. Here's all the things you could not do on Facebook. You couldn't turn the photo if it was this way and you wanted it that way. You couldn't crop it. You couldn't do red eye reduction. You couldn't send it to a shop to print and get your photos in the mail. You could do one thing, though, that you could not do on any other site. And that was that if I was in a photo with my parents and my brothers, I could tag that here are the people in the photo with me, and then it would automatically be shared with my friends and be shared with their friends. And because of that one feature, Facebook quickly became the #1 photo sharing site in the world, and we believe that today there are more photos on Facebook than anywhere else, any other site combined. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Most of the photos we take are of people, and most of the reason you take those photos are to share them with other people. Now, a second example, I mentioned earlier that we think about ourselves as a platform, and what we really try to do is enable people to come onto Facebook and build on top of Facebook to take advantage of the social graph. So if you think about the gaming industry, and by gaming I mean video games, that I'll give a comparison of two great companies. One, Electronic Arts, company that's located just down the road from Facebook headquarters in San Francisco, and they build these fantastic video games. You would look at these things and you would think they look more like an IMAX movie kind of thing. You look at these incredible graphics, deep immersive experiences. And then a company called Zynga, also based in San Francisco. They're just down the road from one another. How many people here have played Cityville or Farmville or one of these games? Few people are willing to admit. I was trying to explain this to my parents last night about hundreds of millions of people going and buying virtual tractors, and safe to say they didn't get it, and I suspect...
Did they figure it out?
What's that?
Did they figure it out?
Intellectually, yes. I think emotionally, no. So I think the notion is if you go and play these games, or if you look at them, you would look at the graphics and you would not say they look like anything that you would see in a movie theater. They look very basic. They look like the games that I played on Atari in 1981. But there's a fundamental difference that explains why Zynga's games have a couple of 100 million users, and if you believe their private market valuation, why they've zoomed past Electronic Arts, why they've zoomed past EA in terms of valuation. Their games are really social experiences wrapped around, basically with a game wrapper around them. You cannot do anything, you cannot succeed in any of these games without interacting with your friends and them interacting back with you. And so they create this really engaging experience that draws you in and keeps you coming back time and again. And the result has been that it's really transforming the gaming industry. So we think, as you think through industry by industry, we think that each industry in its own way is going to be remade and become more social. In music, we see this in Europe with Spotify, that's enabling much more sharing of music. So instead of going in and just seeing what's the new album, here's the new Lady Gaga album, even though I might never be interested in buying that, I would say, here's what your friends are listening, here's the new music that just came out that your friends have bought, and that's a much better and richer experience. So that's the type of direction that we see the world going as more and more people get on, more people share, and importantly, more and more people get empowered and have the opportunity to rise up and to have voice, and yes, to share information about the mundane things they're doing, but also importantly, to change the world in some profound ways as we're seeing. Thank you very much.